The road to nowhere. The sun hung low in the morning sky, its golden light filtering through the bedroom window of 12-year-old Ava Carter. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, dreading the school day ahead. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of her mother Naomi Carter moving around in the kitchen. The smell of eggs and toast drifted through the house, but Ava had no appetite. She sighed, rolling onto her side and hugging her pillow. She didn't want to go to school. Not today. Not ever. Really. Ava. Her mother's voice rang out. Breakfast is ready. With a heavy sigh, she dragged herself out of bed, pulled on her school uniform, and slowly made her way downstairs. Her mother was standing by the stove, flipping an omelet in a pan. She looked up as Ava entered, her warm brown eyes immediately reading the tension on her daughter's face. "You okay, baby?" Naomi asked, concern etching her features. Ava hesitated. She wanted to tell her mother the truth, that school was a nightmare, that the other kids whispered behind her back, that she felt like she didn't belong. But she didn't want to worry her. Naomi already worked 2 jobs just to keep their small house in order. The last thing Ava wanted was to add more stress to her mother's life. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a small smile. Naomi studied her for a moment but didn't press. Instead, she walked over, planting a kiss on Ava's forehead. "Eat something before you go. You need your strength." Ava sat down at the kitchen table, pushing her food around with her fork. She could hear the school bus approaching from down the street. The deep, familiar hiss of the brakes sent a shiver down her spine. "I gotta go," she said, grabbing her backpack and heading for the door. Naomi called after her, "Love you, baby girl." "Love you too," Ava replied automatically, stepping outside. The bus waited at the curb, its door yawning open like the mouth of a hungry beast. The driver, Carl Henson, barely looked at her as she climbed on board. He was an older man, in his late 50s, with a thick gut and a permanent scowl carved into his face. His uniform was stained, his breath always reeked of stale coffee and cigarettes, and his eyes held a certain sharpness that made Ava uncomfortable. She avoided eye contact as she walked down the aisle. The moment she passed the first few rows, the whispers began. "Look who decided to show up. Guess her mom still thinks she owns the place. Bet she cried last night." Ava clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack. She kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard them, until she reached her usual seat, 4 rows from the back, next to the window. She slumped down, pulling her hoodie over her head, and stared outside. The bus rumbled forward, rolling through the streets of their small town. Ava tried to lose herself in the passing scenery, but she could feel Carl's gaze flicking to her in the rearview mirror every now and then. "Bet your mama's real proud," he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Ava's stomach twisted, but she said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that responding only made things worse. Carl didn't stop there. "You know, back in my day, kids had respect for authority, but you lot." He chuckled darkly. "Nothing but trouble." A few students laughed under their breath, while others looked away, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Ava swallowed hard, keeping her eyes locked on the window. Just a few more minutes, she told herself. Just a few more minutes until she was off this bus. But Carl wasn't done. "People like your mama think they can change the world, huh?" he sneered. "Think they can just come in and take over. Tell folks how to live their lives. Well, let me tell you something, little girl. That kind of thinking don't last long." The bus was dead silent now. Ava's face burned, her hands curling into fists in her lap. Her mother had been fighting to improve conditions in the community, especially for people like them. Families who had struggled for generations to find equal footing. But not everyone liked change, and clearly, Carl was one of them. Still, Ava refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The bus hit a bump, jostling everyone forward. Carl laughed under his breath and muttered, "Oops." Ava bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. The bus reached the school parking lot, And before it had even come to a complete stop, Ava was on her feet, rushing toward the door. She barely noticed the other students watching her, whispering. She just needed to get out. The moment her feet hit the pavement, she took a deep breath. Fresh air, freedom. But she knew this was only temporary. At the end of the day, she'd have to get back on that bus. The afternoon ride. A nightmare unfolds. The school day passed in a blur. Ava barely paid attention in class. She wasn't thinking about math or history. She was thinking about the ride home. About Carl. About the kids who watched but never spoke up. The final bell rang, and dread settled in her stomach like a stone. She trudged outside, heart pounding, as she spotted the familiar yellow bus waiting by the curb. The other kids climbed on, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong. As if Ava wasn't about to walk into a war zone. She stepped on board. Carl smirked at her. Back again. Thought maybe you'd walk home today. A few kids snickered. Ava ignored him, moving to her seat. The bus lurched forward, rattling down the road. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the town. Carl seemed angrier this afternoon. Bolder. You know, he called out, I've been thinking maybe some people don't belong in places they don't appreciate. Ava's fingers dug into her jeans. Carl glanced at her in the mirror. Maybe they need a reminder of where they really belong. The bus swerved. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs as Carl jerked the wheel sharply, pulling off the main road onto a deserted highway surrounded by nothing but trees. A murmur of confusion spread through the bus. Where are we going? Someone asked. Carl didn't answer. The bus slowed to a stop on the side of the empty road. Then he turned in his seat, locking eyes with Ava. Out, he ordered. The air left Ava's lungs. The other students exchanged nervous glances, whispering amongst themselves. Ava gripped her backpack. What? Carl's face darkened. You heard me. Get off the bus. Now. Silence. Ava felt every single eye on her. She looked around, hoping, praying, that someone would speak up. No one did. Her throat tightened. But Carl slammed his fist against the dashboard, making everyone jump. Now, Ava's entire body trembled. Her legs felt like lead as she slowly stood up. No one moved to stop her. Not a single voice rose in protest. She walked to the front of the bus. Carl pulled the lever. The doors hissed open. Ava stared at the empty road ahead, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned back, looking at the faces of her classmates, searching for anything, pity, guilt, even a flicker of defiance. All she saw was fear, and then, with a final, terrifying slam, the bus doors shut behind her. The bus roared to life, kicking up dust. And then it was gone, leaving Ava alone, on a deserted highway, with nowhere to go. The long walk begins. Ava stood frozen on the side of the road, her heart hammering in her chest as the bus disappeared in a trail of dust. The distant roar of the engine faded into the silence of the empty highway, leaving her utterly alone. She turned in a slow circle, scanning her surroundings, but there was nothing but thick trees lining both sides of the road. The golden light of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, making everything seem surreal, like a dream she desperately wanted to wake up from. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. The panic settled in the pit of her stomach like a cold, heavy stone. She had no phone, no way to call for help. Her mother had warned her about the importance of carrying one, but with money being tight, Ava hadn't pushed the issue. Now, she wished she had listened. The town was miles away, and she had no idea how long it would take to walk back. Worse still, she didn't know if anyone would come looking for her. Would Carl even report that he had thrown her off the bus, or would he pretend like nothing had happened, leaving her stranded for hours? Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the straps on her backpack, forcing herself to think rationally. She couldn't just stand here. No one was going to rescue her. She had to keep moving. Turning toward the direction of town, She started walking, her sneakers scuffing against the rough asphalt. The road stretched on endlessly, an empty ribbon cutting through the wilderness. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of her footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze swept through the trees. Every now and then, a bird called out from the branches above, but otherwise, the world felt eerily still. Her mind raced as she walked. How could Carl do this to her? She had known he disliked her. His comments and the way he looked at her made that obvious. But this was something else entirely. This was deliberate, malicious. He had wanted to prove something, to humiliate her, to put her in her place, and no one had stopped him. Not a single person had spoken up, had tried to intervene. They had all just sat there and watched, complicit in their silence. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give Carl the satisfaction, even if he wasn't here to see it. Instead, she focused on moving forward, one step at a time. The air grew cooler as the sun continued to dip toward the horizon. Shadows stretched farther, swallowing the road in patches of darkness. Ava glanced behind her, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing, just the growing emptiness of the highway. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, and still, no cars passed by. The town wasn't far, was it? It had seemed like a short drive on the bus, but walking was different. The distance felt endless. The weight of her backpack pressed heavily against her shoulders, and her legs ached from the relentless pace she was forcing herself to maintain. Every now and then, she glanced up at the sky, watching as the deep oranges and purples of dusk faded into the first hints of night. A cold wind blew through the trees, sending a chill down her spine. The temperature was dropping, and she was still nowhere near home. Fear crept up her spine, mingling with exhaustion. She had to keep going, but she had no idea how much longer she could last. Just as doubt began to set in, a sound broke the silence. The faint, distant rumble of an engine. Ava's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. A car. Relief surged through her veins as she turned to see a pair of headlights approaching from far down the road. She stepped closer to the edge of the pavement, raising her hand and waving frantically. As the vehicle drew nearer, she saw that it was an old pickup truck, its headlights dim and its paint faded with age. The engine growled as the driver slowed down, the tires crunching against the gravelly shoulder of the road. Ava's breath caught in her throat as the truck came to a stop beside her. The driver's window rolled down, and a man leaned out, his face shadowed by the dim light. He wore a battered baseball cap, his scruffy beard speckled with gray. "You lost, kid." His voice was rough, but not unkind. Ava hesitated, her fingers curling around the straps of her backpack. Everything in her told her to be careful, to be wary of strangers, but what choice did she have? She was alone, and the night was coming fast. I need to get home," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of water. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. "Where's home?" She swallowed hard. "Town. A few miles from here." He scratched his chin, glancing up and down the empty road. "You've been walking all that way by yourself." When she nodded, he let out a low whistle. "That ain't right. Hop in. I'll take you back." Ava hesitated. She knew better than to trust strangers. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, reminding her that the world wasn't always kind. But what other option did she have? She had no phone, no one around to help her. If she kept walking, she might not make it home before it was completely dark. Still, her gut twisted with uncertainty. I think I'll keep walking," she said, stepping back slightly. The man didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like he understood her hesitation. "Suit yourself," he said, shifting the truck back into gear. "But be careful, all right? Ain't safe for a kid to be out here alone." With that, he drove off, the red taillights disappearing into the distance. Ava let out a shaky breath, watching as the truck faded from view. Maybe she should have taken the ride. Maybe she had just made a huge mistake, but at least she still had control of her situation. At least for now. Squaring her shoulders, she turned back toward the road and kept walking. The night stretched ahead of her like a vast, unending void, and for the first time, she truly understood just how alone she was. A journey into the unknown. The sky had darkened considerably by the time Ava reached the first bend in the road. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a faint, eerie glow of twilight. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a crisp chill nipped at her exposed skin. She hugged herself, trying to conserve warmth, but the weight of exhaustion was beginning to settle deep into her bones. Each step felt heavier than the last, her legs aching from the long walk, her backpack feeling like an anchor dragging her down. She had never walked this far before, never felt this alone. The last remnants of daylight were slowly being consumed by the thickening shadows of night. The distant chirp of crickets filled the air, and every now and then the rustling of leaves made her glance over her shoulder, her heart pounding. The darkness was playing tricks on her mind. Every shape in the trees seemed to morph into something sinister. Every gust of wind felt like invisible fingers brushing against her skin. She forced herself to keep walking, telling herself that she would reach town soon, that this road had to lead somewhere familiar. But the truth was, she had never walked this way before. She had always ridden the bus, always seen the world from behind the glass of a moving vehicle. Now, on foot, everything seemed unfamiliar, stretched out and endless. The road ahead twisted and turned in ways she didn't recognize. The trees loomed taller, more imposing, their thick branches intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. There were no streetlights, no houses, no landmarks to guide her. Just the road, stretching into the unknown, and the cold air whispering in her ears. Ava glanced behind her once more, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. A trick of her imagination, no doubt, but the fear was real. She tightened her grip on her backpack straps, pressing forward, forcing herself to focus on the sound of her own footsteps, the steady rhythm of her breath. Then, in the distance, she saw something that made her heart jolt. A dim glow. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was there, a soft, flickering light, like the glow of a fire or the dull beam of a lantern. Hope surged through her veins. Maybe it was a house. Maybe someone lived out here after all. She quickened her pace, her sore legs protesting with every step, but the idea of warmth, of safety, was enough to push her forward. As she got closer, she realized the light was coming from a small structure tucked away behind the trees. It wasn't a house. It looked more like an old, abandoned cabin. The wooden walls were weathered and worn, the roof slightly caved in on one side. The windows were dark, except for one, where the flickering light glowed softly. Ava hesitated, her initial excitement giving way to caution. Who lived out here? Should she even approach? Her instincts screamed at her to be careful, but her exhaustion overrode her fear. She needed help. She needed to know where she was. Maybe whoever was inside could point her in the right direction, or at the very least, let her use a phone. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped off the road and onto the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin. The leaves crunched beneath her sneakers as she moved forward, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She reached the door, lifting her hand to knock, but before she could, the wooden door creaked open on its own. Ava's breath hitched. Inside, the dim light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. The air smelled of burning wood, but there was something else, a faint metallic scent that she couldn't quite place. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she peered inside. The cabin was small, cluttered with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and various trinkets strewn across the wooden floor. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents spilling onto the floor in disorganized heaps. In the center of the room, an old oil lamp flickered atop a wooden table, its soft glow illuminating the face of a man sitting in a rickety chair. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut right through her. His silver hair was unkempt, his beard thick and tangled. He wore a tattered flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms covered in faded tattoos. He didn't seem surprised to see her. In fact, he looked as if he had been expecting her. "You lost, kid." His voice was gravelly, rough like sandpaper. Ava hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack. I was walking home," she stammered. "I got left on the road. I don't know how far town is." The man studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "You walked all this way alone?" She nodded. He exhaled through his nose, his gaze flicking toward the door, as if expecting someone else to be standing there. When he saw that she was truly alone, his expression darkened slightly. "That's dangerous," he muttered. "These woods aren't safe at night." Ava swallowed hard. "Do you have a phone?" she asked, hopeful. "I just need to call my mom." The man shook his head. "No phone," he said simply. Ava's heart sank. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She hesitated. Something about him made her uneasy, but she was too exhausted to argue. Slowly, she stepped inside, easing into the chair. The wooden frame creaked beneath her weight. She glanced around the cabin, noticing how everything seemed misplaced. There were old photographs on the shelves, but the faces were scratched out. An old radio sat on the counter, covered in dust, as if it hadn't been used in years. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man smirked slightly. "Long enough." Ava nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Her eyes darted toward the window. Outside, the forest was pitch black, the trees swaying in the wind. "You got lucky," the man said suddenly. She turned to look at him. "Lucky?" He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Most folks who end up lost on this road at night don't make it back." Ava's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man sat back, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You ever hear about the disappearances?" Ava shook her head. He exhaled through his nose. "Kids. Teenagers. They go missing around here. Always at night. Some say they ran away. Others say something else got him." A chill ran down Ava's spine. Something else. The man didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You should get moving. If you want to make it home before midnight, you'd best not linger." Ava's throat tightened. "But you stay too long," he cut in, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "You might not make it home at all." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Ava's pulse thundered in her ears as she slowly rose to her feet. The man didn't stop her. He just watched, a knowing look in his eyes. Ava backed toward the door, her legs trembling. She didn't know if he was trying to scare her or if he was telling the truth. But one thing was certain, she couldn't stay here. She turned and bolted back toward the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And as she ran, she could have sworn she heard something moving in the trees behind her. Something big, something not human. Shadows in the dark. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted back toward the road, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The darkness of the night seemed to press in around her, wrapping its cold fingers around her body, making every step feel heavier, more uncertain. The eerie warning from the old man still echoed in her mind, his words sending an unsettling chill down her spine. She didn't know whether he was trying to scare her or if there was truth in what he had said. But she wasn't about to wait around and find out. The trees loomed taller than before, their skeletal branches twisting against the ink-black sky. The wind had picked up, rustling through the leaves, making it sound like whispers were drifting through the night. Every step she took sent crunching sounds beneath her sneakers, but she could hear something else, something faint but distinct, trailing behind her. She wasn't alone. Ava dared not turn around. The thought of seeing something, anything, lurking in the darkness sent terror racing through her veins. She pushed forward, forcing herself to move faster despite the exhaustion creeping into her muscles. The road was still so far away. Every step felt like a battle against the unknown, against the crushing weight of fear. Then suddenly, a snap. Ava's breath hitched. She froze, her entire body going rigid. Somewhere behind her, a branch had broken. Something was out there. Something was following her. Slowly, she turned her head just slightly, her pulse hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She squinted into the shadows between the trees, trying to make out what was there. Nothing. Just darkness, just the quiet rustle of the wind through the forest. But she could feel it, that terrible, gnawing sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond her vision. Ava forced herself to move again, walking quickly, her breathing shallow. She didn't dare run this time. Running meant panic. Running meant mistakes. And if there really was something out here, she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She kept her head forward, her eyes locked onto the distant strip of asphalt where the road cut through the landscape. Just a little farther. Just a little. Another snap. Closer this time. Ava's heart nearly stopped. Her mind raced, frantically trying to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The way it moved, the deliberate crunch of footsteps in the undergrowth, it wasn't aimless. It was tracking her. Ava bit down hard on her lip, forcing herself to keep going. The road was only a few yards away now. If she could just reach it, maybe she could flag down a car. Maybe someone, anyone, would help her. She broke into a jog, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Her legs ached from walking for so long, her lungs burned with each breath, but she pushed through it. She was almost there. And then, the sound came again. Louder, faster. Whatever was following her was moving now. Running. Ava burst onto the road, nearly tripping over herself as she scrambled into the open space. The streetlights were non-existent out here. There was only the dull glow of the stars above. The asphalt stretched in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. No cars, no sign of life. Just emptiness. Ava turned sharply, her breath catching, as she finally looked back. The trees stood silent. The forest stretched on endlessly, dark and impenetrable. There was nothing there. No movement. No eyes reflecting in the dark. But she knew. She knew something had been there. Something had followed her. Something had stopped the moment she stepped onto the road. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry, her hands trembling at her sides. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to calm the wild panic clawing at her chest. She had to keep moving. She had to get home. She turned and started walking again, her pace quick, purposeful. The road stretched before her, empty and unfamiliar, but it was better than the suffocating forest. She was safer here. At least she hoped she was. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt warped, stretched by the exhaustion gripping her body. Her feet ached, her shoulders throbbed under the weight of her backpack. But she didn't stop. She didn't look back. Then, out of the silence, she heard it again. Not from the trees. From the road behind her. Ava's blood ran cold. The footsteps were on the pavement now. Slow, measured. She wasn't just being watched anymore. She was being hunted. Ava clenched her fists, fighting back the rising terror in her chest. She needed to keep moving. She couldn't panic now. She had to. A distant pair of headlights appeared on the horizon. Ava spun around, eyes widening as the glow of an approaching vehicle illuminated the road. Relief surged through her body, overwhelming and desperate. She rushed forward, waving her arms wildly, her voice breaking as she screamed for help. The vehicle, a truck, slowed down. The engine rumbled as it rolled to a stop beside her, and the driver's window lowered. A man sat inside, his face shadowed by the dim glow of the dashboard. His features were hard to make out, but his voice was gruff when he spoke. "You all right, kid?" Ava could barely breathe. She nodded frantically, taking a shaky step toward the truck. "Please, can you take me to town? I was left on the road. I've been walking for hours." The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the dark road behind her, scanning it, his brow furrowing. Then he looked back at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah," he said at last. "Get in." Ava hesitated for only a second before yanking open the door and scrambling inside. The truck was old, the seats cracked and worn, but it felt like the safest place in the world compared to the open road. She slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively. The man put the truck in gear, his hand steady on the wheel. As they pulled forward, Eva glanced at the side mirror, and her heart nearly stopped. There, standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible in the glow of the fading taillights, was a tall figure. Still, motionless, watching. Ava's breath hitched. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there, half shrouded in darkness. Then, as the truck pulled away, the figure took one slow, deliberate step back into the trees and vanished, a ride into uncertainty. Ava sat stiffly in the worn passenger seat of the truck, her entire body tense as the vehicle rumbled forward along the dark, empty road. The heat from the old vents was barely noticeable against the cold seeping into her skin, but she didn't care. Right now, she was grateful for the barrier between her and the vast nothingness of the night. She forced herself to breathe evenly, her hands still gripping the straps of her backpack, as if letting go would somehow make everything unravel. Her mind raced, replaying what she had just seen. The figure standing at the edge of the road, watching. It hadn't been a trick of the light. It had been real. But what terrified her the most was the way it had moved. One slow, deliberate step back into the trees. Like it had chosen to retreat. Like it wasn't done yet. She stole a glance at the driver. He was a middle-aged man, maybe in his 50s, with tired eyes and a scruffy beard peppered with gray. He wore an old flannel jacket, his hands rough and calloused from what looked like years of hard labor. He hadn't spoken since she climbed into the truck, aside from asking if she was all right. He kept his focus on the road, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Eva swallowed hard, shifting in her seat. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "For stopping." The man nodded slightly, but his gaze didn't leave the road. "Ain't safe out here," he said after a long moment. His voice was low and steady, the kind that didn't ask for much conversation, especially not for a kid walking alone at night. Ava nodded, gripping the fabric of her jeans. "I was left on the road, by my bus driver." That got a reaction. The man's brows furrowed, and he flicked his eyes toward her briefly before returning them to the road. "Your bus driver left you out here." His tone wasn't just surprise. It was disbelief, edged with something sharper. Ava nodded, her throat tightening. "Yeah. He told me to get off. Just stopped in the middle of nowhere and made me leave." The man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "What the hell's wrong with people these days?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Ava let out a shaky breath, staring at the dark landscape rushing past outside. The trees looked even taller now, stretching endlessly on both sides of the road. The sky was void of light except for the distant pinpricks of stars, offering no comfort against the eerie vastness of the wilderness. "Where you headed?" the man asked after a moment. Ava hesitated. She had no reason to lie. But after everything that had happened, she couldn't shake the wariness creeping up her spine. Still, what choice did she have? "Town," she answered finally. "I live a few miles from the school. My mom, she's probably worried sick." The man gave another small nod. "We'll get you there." Ava wanted to believe that, but something about the way he said it made her uneasy. "We'll get you there." Not "I'll get you there." Something about the wording twisted in her gut, but she tried to shake it off. He was just some guy trying to help, right? He had no reason to hurt her. He had stopped when he saw her on the road. He hadn't asked weird questions, hadn't made her feel unsafe. But something felt wrong. The silence in the truck stretched on. The old radio on the dashboard crackled with static, as if it had been left on but wasn't picking up a station. The man didn't bother to turn it off. The longer Ava sat there, the more aware she became of the sound, the low, buzzing hiss of white noise filling the cabin like an unseen presence. She shifted uncomfortably. "Do you live around here?" she asked, trying to distract herself. The man was quiet for a beat before answering. "Used to. Not anymore." His answer was clipped, final, like he didn't want to say more. Ava nodded slowly, keeping her hands folded in her lap. She had a million questions swirling in her mind, but the fear of pushing too hard kept her from asking them. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic hum of the truck's tires against the road, trying to ground herself. Then, out of nowhere, the truck jolted violently to one side. Ava gasped, her hands flying to the dashboard to brace herself. The man let out a sharp curse, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the vehicle swerved wildly, the tires skidding against the asphalt. Something had hit them. Or had they hit something? The truck lurched to a stop, the engine growling as the man fought to regain control. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, broken only by the uneven rhythm of Ava's breathing. The man exhaled sharply, his grip still tight on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Ava turned her head slowly, peering through the windshield. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the darkness. The trees on either side stood still, unmoving. There was nothing there. But then why had the truck swerved? Ava's fingers trembled as she reached for the seatbelt strap across her chest. Did we hit something? The man didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the road, scanning it, his jaw tight. Then, without a word, he shoved the door open and stepped out. Ava's stomach clenched. "Wait," she started, but he was already moving. She watched as he stepped into the glare of the headlights, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the pavement. He scanned the road, then crouched down, running his hand over the asphalt as if searching for something. Ava swallowed hard. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stay put, to keep the doors locked and not move. But she couldn't shake the sickening sense that something wasn't right. Then, the man stiffened. Ava saw it, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his head turned slightly, as if he had just heard something. Her breath caught in her throat. He stood slowly, backing toward the truck, his gaze locked on something just beyond the reach of the headlights. And then, he bolted. Ava barely had time to react before he threw himself back into the truck, slamming the door shut behind him. "Lock the doors," he ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. Ava's hands fumbled for the lock, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. What did you see?" The man's face was pale, his knuckles white as they gripped the wheel. His eyes flicked to the mirror, his breath coming faster now. Ava turned, following his gaze. And that's when she saw it. Something was standing in the road, tall, motionless. The same shadowed figure from before. But this time, it was closer. And this time, it was smiling. The last stretch. The world seemed to tilt as Ava's vision tunneled, her heartbeat a deafening drum inside her ears. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans, squeezing so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. The figure standing in the middle of the road was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was human in shape, but wrong in every other way. The way it stood, perfectly still, perfectly upright, too rigid to be natural. Its elongated limbs looked stretched, as if pulled too hard in opposite directions. The face, if it even had one, was barely visible in the dim light, but the smile, that awful, unnatural smile, was unmistakable. Wide. Too wide. Ava's breath hitched in her throat as the man beside her let out a sharp curse under his breath. He didn't hesitate. His hands were already moving, gripping the steering wheel like a vice. "Hold on." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, yet there was a sense of urgency behind it. Without warning, he threw the truck into reverse, the tires screeching against the pavement as they jerked backward. Ava's body lurched forward, the seatbelt biting into her shoulder as the truck shot backward down the road. Her hands flew to the dashboard, bracing herself against the force. The headlights flickered slightly as the beams swept across the darkened landscape. And that's when she saw it. The figure moved. Not like a person. Not like anything natural. 1 second it was standing still. The next, it was closer. Not running. Not walking. Just closer. Ava's stomach dropped. "Go," she screamed. The man didn't need to be told twice. He yanked the gear shift forward, slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, and the truck lunged ahead. The tires spun against the asphalt before catching traction, propelling them forward at breakneck speed. The figure didn't move this time. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly as if watching them leave. Ava couldn't tear her eyes away, even as the truck sped down the empty highway. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had just seen. What the hell was that? She choked out. The man didn't answer right away. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck were taut. He kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Something we weren't supposed to see," he muttered after a long silence, "and something we sure as hell weren't supposed to survive." Ava swallowed the lump in her throat. That wasn't the answer she wanted. She turned slightly, glancing at the side mirror. Nothing. Whatever that thing was, it was gone, or it had chosen to disappear. But something told her this wasn't over. The truck barreled down the road, moving faster than before, the tension inside the cabin thick enough to suffocate her. Ava tried to steady her breathing, but the adrenaline still coursing through her veins made it impossible to calm down. She wasn't sure how long they drove. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging. Every dark patch of trees looked the same. Every bend in the road made her stomach twist with anticipation, expecting to see that thing again. But it didn't return. After what felt like an eternity, the first glimmers of distant streetlights appeared on the horizon. The sight was so sudden, so unexpected, that Ava almost thought she was hallucinating. The tiny glow of civilization, a promise of safety, sent a surge of relief through her exhausted body. The man exhaled heavily. "Almost there," he muttered. Ava nodded silently, too drained to say anything else. The truck finally slowed as they reached the outskirts of town. Familiar buildings came into view. Stores, gas stations, houses. The world that had once felt so distant was suddenly right there. The man pulled the truck into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store. The buzzing neon lights flickered above them, bathing everything in a harsh, artificial glow. "This where you need to be?" the man asked, his voice quieter now. Ava hesitated. "No, my house is a little farther. But I think I can walk from here." The man nodded, but he didn't make a move to leave. Instead, he turned in his seat, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes, weary and bloodshot, held something that almost resembled fear. "You tell anyone about tonight," he said, his voice low. "They won't believe you." Ava swallowed hard. "I don't care if they believe me. I just want to go home." The man studied her for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Yeah," he muttered, "me too." She reached for the door handle, hesitating for only a second before pulling it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she forced herself to step out. Before she closed the door, she turned back. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. The man gave her a tight nod. "You be safe, kid." Ava shut the door, watching as the truck idled for a moment before pulling away, disappearing down the road without another word. For a long time, she just stood there, letting the reality of the night sink in. The fluorescent glow of the convenience store felt jarring, too bright, too normal after what she had just been through. She glanced up at the sky. The stars were still there. The world was still spinning. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was watching. She turned, taking slow, measured steps toward home, trying not to let the paranoia creep in. But even as she walked, she couldn't stop herself from glancing over her shoulder. And in the distance, at the very edge of the shadows, she thought she saw a smile. But when she blinked, it was gone.